I think we are setting up the live now. Just give it a few more
I
seconds.
don't think you are recording yet.
Yeah. I think we are now on YouTube. So Prashant, you can start.
Okay, very good, fantastic. So welcome back for this third
Sorry,
day.
I cannot record it. I'm not given the permission.
Just
Could you
hold.
please do it?
Yeah, just hold on a second. Let me check whether you are co-host here. Yeah, just hold on a second. Yeah, I've made you co-host once more. Let's see if that works, Prashant.
Yeah.
Are you getting the record option?
Yes,
now,
it works.
yes.
Oh, perfect. Professor Rabate, over to you. Yeah.
Wonderful. So welcome back for this third day of discussions of Derrida's work on literature. And today we'll focus on a slightly later moment in Derrida, a moment when Derrida starts working systematically with poets and on poetry. And so we'll begin with a general statement about poetry, mostly in that weird text, Que cosa è la poesia, that I think has to be understood in a dialogue with Heidegger, but also with the usual poets Derrida has worked with, Paul Celan being the main friend and model for him. And indeed, one can see that Celan is very, very often quoted in the seminars and in many texts. And then we'll end with Ponge, a slightly earlier discussion, because this is the occasion to look at a poetry that is not as difficult as Celan's poetry, and to see what Derrida is doing in his very specific, very particular, very innovative readings. I'll begin with a general statement, and here I'll share with you that, which is a rapid summary I made of the presentation of the 1998 presentations by Derrida. And what's interesting is that you had this very simple question, Que cos'è la poesia? Which literally translated is common Italian, but what thing is poetry? And Derrida liked this question that seemed to assume that poetry was definable as a thing, and he gave a very witty, very strange text, and he gave, one might call it a parable, comparing poetry with a hedgehog. And so he thinks in several languages, in French, hérisson, istrice in Italian, and he's also thinking at times in German and in Greek, and even in Arabic. In Derrida's fable, there is this little animal trying to cross a road, autoroute, highway, and it can be run over by speeding cars, and it can lie in a ball, and it can manage to cross the road. So the fable of this poor hedgehog, the hedgehog is poetry or is a poem, calls up the contingency of poetic experience and the fragility of its being. And indeed, I have to say, I note for my own practice of teaching literature in a good American university, one can distinguish people who read poetry and the majority who do not, who feel very at a loss facing poetry, and for whom poetry is very traditional. And basically, one can say that those who read poetry are people who write poetry. So Derrida, as far as I know, never really wrote or published poetry. He's not like Lacan, who we know at least wrote and published one sonnet. I don't think we will find in Derrida, as we find with Marx, let's say, a very interesting early work of the early poems of Marx that are not so bad, I have to say, for those of you who read Marx. And Marx's early novel, of which we have just a few fragments, is also very interesting. But I don't think Derrida has this kind of body of poetry behind, but he kept returning to the question of poetry and this idea of here the German romantics are behind, because this metaphor came from Schlegel and we have it in other romantic texts. And we know, in order to understand well Derrida's positioning of German Romanticism, the best is to have a look at the wonderful book put together by Jean-Luc Nancy and Philippe Lacour-Labarthe, The Literary Absolute, that Derrida always uses and quotes. But what is quite surprising in Que cause la poesia is that Derrida defines poetry by this simple feature. It is a text that requires to be learned by heart. The essence of poetry should be defined by two main conditions, what he called the economy of memory. You cannot today memorize a very long poem. The poem must be brief, elliptical, and the heart. It's an interesting notion here. When this economy of poetry or memory and the heart are combined, what is created is the poetic. And there is a desire to learn, at least. This is what Derrida is saying. And I think it's a good and simple point of departure. And I completely feel this in myself, that when I start reading a poem I don't know, something that strikes me, I say, oh, I wish I can remember it. So, as he says, but, and from the other thing to the other under dictation by heart, imparare a memoria, in Italian. In French, we have that expression, learn by heart. To learn by heart, we know, was an ancient practice of teaching. As you may know, it is still used, like most Muslims will know the Quran by heart or section of the Quran by heart. Many of my Italian friends know, if not the entirety, at least snatches of Dante's Commedia by heart. In France, we have lost a little bit that practice, but I have to say the one time I came back to teach in my old university in Dijon, having been in the US for a while, I taught a huge class on poetry in English, 20th century poetry, English and American, and like 400 students, and it was very hard to manage. I had a very long microphone, happily, and each class, I asked students to memorize a poem. And so they had to come at the beginning of the class for 15 minutes. We would do this like a game and say, who has one poem? And then they would come, and I would finally see them, because otherwise I would not see this mass of people who would distinguish them. And at the time they failed, they didn't remember, people would help them. Then when they finished, everybody clapped. And this was a class that worked fantastically because of that, learning by heart. They all said, oh, thank you. We had forgotten we could do that. So this corresponds to this idea that Derrida has, that he sees poetry as dictated. Poetry, in a sort of prosopopoeia, speaks in his text. I am a dictation. Learn me by heart. Copy me down. Guard and keep me. Look out for me. So we have to see what is this heart, the movement of the heart, and the heart that learns, the heart of a certain interiority. And so Derrida, you have to commemorate amnesia, savagery, and even the stupidity of the by heart, the hérisson. It blinds itself, rolled up in a ball, prickly with spines, vulnerable and dangerous, calculating and ill-adapted, because it makes itself into a ball. It exposes itself to an accident. No poem without accident. No poem that does not open itself like a wound, but no poem that is not also just a wounding. And we'll see that Derrida, in all his readings of poetry and of literature more generally, but I think mostly with poetry, insists on this idea of accident, singularity. Remember that even with Poe and Lacan's reading, Derrida wanted to open the possibility of this circulation of the letter to an accident, refusing Lacan's Hegelian optimism that sees an economy always at work. That is, that for Lacan, the letter always returns to its, if not sender, at least addressee. This is this idea that we find in Kafka. In a famous letter of 1904, Kafka said a real text, and he's not talking about poetry, he's talking about literature in general, should be like a traumatic event. It should wound us. It should be like a suicide of a friend. It should be something terrible that wakes us up. And Kafka, and this, and you probably know that passage, it should be the axe that breaks the frozen sea in us. And so this is indeed, one forget that Kafka had in 1904, before he wrote any of the texts we know, this ambition to wound. And for Derrida, a poetry is a wound. And let's not forget that when we speak of trauma, in Greek, trauma originally means wound. So it's traumatic poetry, we might say, or a traumatic theory of poetry. What is, of course, interesting in this text is the choice of an animal, hérisson. And as the, we can take a look, if you want, very rapid look at the text. Okay, I don't have it here, but if we look at the signifiers in Derrida's Que cause la poesia, one can see that both in Italian and in French, hérisson is playing with the signifiers. In a sort of side glance towards Ezra Pound, and we could talk about Pound if you know Pound. It's something that has interested me more recently, and I was in a conversation in China 2 weeks ago, and we're talking of Pound. Ezra Pound's cantos, some of you may know, especially the Pisan cantos, have exactly the same configuration as what Derrida presents as the essence of poetry. For Pound, who thought that he was going to be executed, having been a supporter of Mussolini and a fascist, one might say, after the Second World War, and was more or less awaiting death in a cell in Pisa, he thought he was writing his testament, and basically he defined poetry as what remains in your heart, what you have learned by heart. And he quotes Cavalcanti's famous poem defining love. And for Cavalcanti, dove sta memoria, where memory is. And I want to insist on this because Pound as well was writing, of course, in English, but with all these Italian echoes, and Derrida, who knew Pound, may have been thinking of him. This hérisson, hedgehog, in French, it's a funny name, hérisson. A nourrisson hérisson, as he says, a baby hedgehog. It's a tiny hedgehog. I don't know whether you have hedgehogs in India, but we see them a lot in France and in Germany and in England as well. There's so many hedgehogs in England. They cross the roads, it is true. They come from the wood. They are often killed. That really happens. And of course, probably Derrida is thinking of a tradition that goes back to Heidegger and to Heidegger's notion of the heart. And I'll look at it in a moment. In a second text that I will just show you, because it's a text of a neuroscientist. What happened in our brain when we learn something, by Sandrone, an Italian. So I thought, okay, let me give you some hard science today. So Sandrone reminds us of things you may know. Why the heart? Why learning by heart? Which seems a little strange, because you could imagine that it is the memory we tend to see in the brain. The 4th century before Christ, the Greek philosopher Aristotle thought that the heart was the most important organ of our body, the essential center for learning and mnestic processes. Today, we know that learning and memorizing are cerebral and not cardiac function. There are remains of Aristotle's vision in the expressions used to say memorize something in English, French, and Arabic, respectively. Learn by heart, apprendre par cœur, Hafisa and Sarikal. I want to insist on this because indeed in English, learn by heart, and I have worked on this in a text I published a year ago. We find it emerge in Chaucer's poetry. And as you know, Chaucer was bilingual. He also knew French very well. So it is this French notion, in Old French, par cœur, in English, by heart. At that time, heart was called heart, H-E-R-T-E. In Arabic too, Arabic, as I insisted with the Quran, but earlier enough, you had this practice of memorizing. And one can say that it was also a Jewish practice of memorizing the text. This was the work of a philosopher James Joyce found very interesting for him when he was writing his last work, and we'll talk about this on the tomorrow and the last day. Joyce was impressed by the works of Jousse, Jousse, who was working on the way the Gospels were written in Aramaic so as to be remembered. They were already encoded with parallelisms that corresponded, according to Jousse, to the way the body, the whole body, is put in motion by a text. That is, for him, when we have the 4 Gospels and all the parables of Jesus, they are meant to be memorized or eaten in the body. So the heart, in a way, brings this notion of the entire body, that poetry must be recited, must be performed. And so what you have in this text, just the introduction to a long technical analysis, is how memory functions. And I want to mention this because I have to say I was extremely happy to meet him in New York, the now Nobel laureate Eric Richard Kendall, who is an amazing writer. If you come across his work, he has discovered a number of cells in animals. So we, again, need animals to understand memory. What happened inside the brain during a learning task. And he has discovered complicated schemes of how memory works. But in fact, it is true that memory and the molecular basis of memory changes your whole being somehow. And so he insists, Eric Kendall, he has written a recent book on Vienna. He comes from Vienna, but he knows French and he's now in the US, on the way looking at art and remembering poetry improve our well-being. And I completely agree with that. And so I'll move on to another text that is not far from, so here is rapidly the text of Derrida, if you can see it, nouveau partage. So what you see here in that text is that Derrida has, and so here I quote the Arabic, l'Arabe, Hafisa and Harika to learn by heart. And so in the original, it was in 2 columns, one in Italian, one in French. Le poétique. See, Derrida distinguishes between the poetic and poetry. And if he talks about this animal, it is idea that the animal is thrown. Notre poem, I'll quote just this. Our poem does not hold still within name, not even within word. It is, first of all, thrown out on the roads and in the fields, sing beyond languages. And even if it is sometimes happen that it records itself in language, when it gathers itself up, rolled up in a ball on itself, it is more threatened than ever in its retreat. It thinks it is defending itself and it loses itself. Literally, you would like to retain by heart an absolutely unique form, an event whose intangible singularity no longer separates the ideality, the ideal meaning, as one says, from the body of the letter. Here, I want to insist on this notion that I have mentioned in passing, but a little too quickly. Ideality. Ideality is not idealism, and it is a concept that Derrida borrows from Husserl, and we'll see how it works. But we know that one of the earliest topics that Derrida had chosen for his earlier research before he decided to work on the origin of geometry in Husserl was a dissertation that would have been on the ideality of the literary object. That is, what makes this object ideal, not just material, not just the written traces on a manuscript or what we have in our computers and so on, but the ideality, which is the ideal shape of a text, what makes it something that you can then translate, then memorize, perform, and so on. There is a certain ideality that is a Platonician form that remains beyond all the material inscriptions of it. But this ideality has to be connected with the heart. Now, the heart is a synecdoche for the body, but we could say a body of affects. Okay, so I'll stop that. Take a look at this really wonderful, astonishing poem, and I'll say that here again to share. We have this notion of learning why the heart, and here it's a text I have written and published somewhere. We are back, if you remember, to the questions posed by Freud. Remember that Freud was talking about Bahnung, mnemotechnics, Erinnerung. Erinnerung is more a Hegelian term, but remember that for Freud, everything begins with the question of memory. How is memory facilitated by certain neurons? How is it recorded and partly obliterated, of course? So is it because of the heart? Yes, Freud will say yes. If we say, remember what I was saying about forgetting, in Freud's analysis of parapraxis, one could say that it is my heart that makes me forget the name of somebody I don't like, or the name of somebody I'm trying to recover, but who unhappily sounds too much like the name of somebody I don't like. And then I will not remember it. And then maybe an hour later, it will come back to me. So we can say that this heart, a sort of metaphorical heart, is at work in Derrida and in Freud. I'm also quoting a wonderful book by Eric Jaeger called The Book of the Heart. And in that book, Eric Jaeger follows the just that sentence, the Book of the Heart. And he shows that it was Augustine who used it systematically. And so remember that Augustine was so important for Derrida. The Book of the Heart, as it appeared in the writings of early Christian thinkers such as Origen and Ambrose, was developed further by Augustine of Hippo, the most influential of all the church fathers. Augustine extended the range and subtlety of patristic textual metaphors as part of a comprehensive theory of the written work that was the first of its kind. And Jaeger, so I'll just quote a few passages because it's mostly the Confessions, and you've seen how Derrida imitates in his own way, very different, of course, because you would not imagine Augustine talking about his sexual organs, but Augustine is always talking about the heart and the inner person. The inner person, interior life were centered in the heart, understood in its biblical sense. So that's the key, as the moral and spiritual core of the human being. Throughout his writings, Augustine portrayed the heart as a place of writing, erasure, reading, interpretation, and other textual operations. This shows that Derrida didn't choose the Confessions as a literary model randomly, not just because, as we saw, he felt a fraternity with this African thinker, Augustine, but because Augustine's powerful language, I don't know whether you've read the Confessions, but if one has some Latin, it's superb Latin, I have to say. The term is recordatio, which is memory, remembering something, recollection, as we say in English. But as you can see, recordatio in Latin has something to do with recording. When we record that we are recording this lecture, see, is it with a heart? Maybe not, it's with a machine, but somehow it has the heart, at least as the addressee of the recording. My heart is wherever I am. And then Augustine, in some passages of the Confessions, puns. That's quite interesting to see. The Latin of Augustine is full of puns. It's quite surprising. We anticipate James Joyce, one could say. And he writes this, coram te cor meum et recordatio mea, should be recordatio, not recordation. In front of you, coram, but coram, which means in front of, is also core, the radical of core, for the idea of the heart, that echo, ecce cor meum, Deus ecce cor meum. Look at my heart, look at my heart. Here is my heart. God is presented by Augustine as somebody who can look into our inmost hearts. This is also something that Derrida finds in the poetry of Paul Celan, and I'll return to him. You find this in Circumfession. It's a poem, it's a very dark poem of Celan. Es war Blut, it was blood that you shed, Lord. And so we'll return to Celan as also a poet, I would say, of the heart in some way. And but I want also to mention a reference that is always there for Derrida, and it is the reference to Heidegger. And for this, I have to show you something which is not so often mentioned, but which I think underpins. I hope you are you seeing the text of Heidegger? Yeah.
Yes.
I hope yes. So it is in a long and I would say difficult essay by Heidegger, what are poets for, and it is mostly a meditation on Rilke. And you have here 16 lines that are numbered, and in the passage I want to rapidly gloss, focuses on the last lines, line 12, line 11. I can line 10. There, outside all caring, this creates for us a safety just there, where the pure force's gravity rules. In the end, it is our unshieldedness on which we depend, and that when we saw it threaten, we turned it so into the open that in widest orbit somewhere where the law touches it, we may affirm it. Rilke is talking about real life and poetry. And he insists on the two terms that Heidegger focuses on are those of the open. What is the open? For it's a key concept for Heidegger, and it is also this idea of unshieldedness. To Heidegger says, okay, I think my screen is a little off. Can you see better now? I hope you can. So the open, and we return to it, the open is one of the central intuitions of Rilke, who in his poetry is always situating, you might say, death as the inmost truth of each human being and also of animals. Rilke is often writing about animals, but the open is not just nature, but it is more than nature. It is nature when we, as subject, we leave our mortal bodies, envelopes, and are one with the all, you could say. And so this is what Heidegger is saying, is again trying, as if you know the later Heidegger, he generally tries, and it is something that Alain Badiou does a lot, to use the signifiers of the text he reads. Right here is very, very close to all the signifiers of the poem of Rilke, and then he reshuffles them, he retranslates them, and he makes his own little narrative, but a narrative that is quite powerful. What is it that touches us directly out of the widest orbit? What is it that remains blocked off, withdrawn from ourselves? It is the other draft, death. Death is what touches mortals in their nature, set them on their way to the other side of life, and so into the whole of the pure draft. Death that gathers into the whole what is already positive, into the positive of the whole draft. These are terms of Rilke. And this gathering of positive, death is the laying down, the law, just as the mountain chain, the gathering of the mountains into the whole of its cabin. There, where the law touches us, there is the place within the widest orbit into which we can admit the converted unshieldedness positively into the whole of what is. Our unshieldedness, so converted, finally shelters us within the open, outside all protection. And so it's interesting, he goes on discussing the Duino elegies and this idea of unshieldedness, which is, you could imagine, could be glossed a little by Derrida when he talks about being exposed to the accident. If you are unshielded, it means you are unprotected. We know that, and here, this is just a French commentary, that one of the very important French poets for Derrida, at any rate, and for me as well, Stéphane Mallarmé, had exactly the same intuition as Rilke, because he would pun on his own name, mal armé in French, as such, means badly prepared, unarmed, without arms, without weapons, mal armé, which for Mallarmé meant that he was exposed to the wounds of life. And indeed, we know that one of the tragedies of Mallarmé was that his son, he was very dear to his heart, died when he was 7, quite a tragedy. And this is the tragedy that I think anyone can experience in one's life, and poetry is a sort of opening to the possibility of writing, nevertheless, in spite of those tragedies. Heidegger goes on. He mentions Descartes, the ego cogito, but he mentions Pascal, Blaise Pascal. At nearly the same time as Descartes, Pascal discovered the logic of the heart as over the logic of calculating reason. As we know, Pascal famously said in French, the heart has its reasons that reason knows nothing of. Famous quote of Pascal's Pensées. And we know that Heidegger had read Pascal very closely. The inner and indivisible domain of the heart is not only more inward than the interior that belongs to calculating representation and therefore more invisible, it also extends further than that the realm of merely reproducible objects. Only in the invisible innermost of the heart is man inclined toward what there is for him to love, the forefathers, the dead, the children, those who are to come. All this belongs in the widest orbit, which now proves to be the sphere of the presence of the whole integral draft. True, this presence too, like that of the customary consciousness of calculating production, is a presence of immanence, but the interior of uncustomary consciousness remains the inner space in which everything is for us beyond the arithmetic of calculation, and free of such boundaries can overflow into the unbounded whole region of the open. And this is, he quotes the 9th elegy, and again, the widest orbits of being becomes present in the heart's inner space. The whole of the world achieves here an equally essential presence in all its drawings. Rilke, in the language of metaphysics, speaks of existence, Dasein. And what I would like to say is that if quite often Derrida seems critical of Heidegger, what Heidegger writes here is more or less something that Derrida could subscribe to fully. As you note, there are a number of features that are shared by Derrida, the opposition between calculating reason and the heart open, an existence that is bounded by death, but that can be open to a sort of illumination from by being part of the outside, and the need to go beyond the cogito of Descartes and open up the whole body to something that is the outside, the invisible. And then, not to be too long on Heidegger, but it's a beautiful text, really, this essay of Why Poets. Heidegger quotes, and surprisingly, in that text, if you know a little the poetry of Rilke, Heidegger tries to quote a number of unpublished and later poems of Rilke. This quote is one of the most famous of Rilke, the letters from Muso, 1925. Rilke wrote this about poetry. Our task is to impress this preliminary, transient earth upon ourselves with so much suffering and so passionately that its nature rises up again invisibly within us. See, for Rilke, as for Proust and for Celan, one can say the notion of the heart means that the poet is somebody who suffers and who can suffer, who can withstand suffering and suffers passionately, and at the same time listens to what is invisible. And so this is the famous quote, "We are the bees of the invisible." I want to insist here on another animal metaphor, see, not the hedgehog, but the bees. And then in French, I don't know why Rilke wrote it in French, but he was totally bilingual. Nous butinons éperdument le miel du visible pour l'accumuler dans la grande ruche d'or de l'invisible. We ceaselessly gather the honey of the visible to store it up in the great golden beehive of the invisible. And so this gathering of the honey of the visible is the way Rilke would see his work as a poet. That is to put together a number of very personal impressions, moments where he was hit by something. And we know that in Rilke, there was this quasi mystical belief in angels. If you know the beginning of the Duino elegies and this beautiful opening that is like a scream in German, wer, wenn ich schrie, hörte mich denn aus der Engelsordnungen? Who, if I were to scream, would hear me from the orders of the angels, famous beginning. This is a sentence that Rilke heard from the outside as he was walking near the sea during a storm in Duino, close to Trieste in a castle, the castle of Duino. And so Rilke heard those words and he wrote them down, and then he wrote a beautiful sequence of poetry, the Duino elegies. So this idea that Rilke, imagine Rilke walking along the rocks of Duino in the storm, and his friends were worried that he could be hit by wave, but to listen to the angels, and then discovering that the angels are too powerful and too violent and too terrifying. And they are a figure of terror, as he says, but at the same time, they hit his heart. See, this is what Heidegger is trying to show here. Here, everything is inward. He adds not only that it remains turned toward this true interior of consciousness, but inside this interior, one thing turns free of all bounds into the other. The interiority of the world in a space unbars the open for us. One can say that Derrida would agree completely with all this. Only what we thus retain in our heart, par cœur, only that we truly know by heart. Within this interior, we are free outside of the relation to the objects that around us, and so on. And so, to conclude, I just want to again quote this passage because it's quite often quoted. For Heidegger, this open is an experience of pure being as transcendence. Language intervenes. Being as itself spans its own province, which is marked off, temnine, tempus, by beings being present in the world. Language is the precinct, templum. And Heidegger, in other texts, discusses this idea that a poem is a temple, but not just in a religious sense. Templum, as you may know in Latin, means temple because originally it was that section of the sky that the priest would choose to see which birds would cross it and would try to read the future, templum. That is the house of being. That's, of course, Heidegger's version. The nature of language does not exhaust itself in signifying, nor is it merely something that has the character of sign or cipher. Here again, you can see that Heidegger anticipates Derrida's criticism of the reduction of language to a system of signs, an economy of semiotics, or basic structuralism, or Barthesian structuralism. Language goes beyond. It is because language is the house of being that we reach what is by constantly going through this house. And so this is the then famous paragraph. When we go to the well, when we go to the woods, we are always already going through the word well, through the words woods, even if we do not speak the words and do not think of anything relating to language. Thinking our way from the temple of being, we have an intimation of what they dare, who are sometimes more daring than the being of beings. They dare the precinct of being. They dare language. You may be surprised by this term of daring. I spare you a very long analysis in Heidegger's reading of Rilke of the terms in German, because Rilke plays on Wagen, to dare, and Wagen, an old term to mean to weigh in a balance. And Heidegger concludes that poetry is daring. It's a dare. It's, can I do it? Can you do it? Can you read me? Can I read something? Can you write? Can you write what I read? Can you read what I write? They dare language. So basically, and it is, I think, a sense that we'd find with Celan. Any poet who writes plays a game of dare, see, with language. Can I do it? Can language help me? Can I be in touch with you in that moment of truth or dare? All beings, objects of consciousness and things of the heart, men who impose themselves and men who are more daring, all beings, each in its own way, are qua-being in the precinct of language. This is why the return from the realm of objects and the representation into the innermost region of the heart space can be accomplished, if anywhere, only in this precinct. But you see this astonishing intuition of Heidegger, and Derrida would agree fully with this, that even when we are walking silently in a forest among trees, and of course Heidegger is always thinking in terms of a sort of idealized black forest where he would live, even when we are just mute, silent, contemplative, and so on, we are walking through a forest of language, of words. We do not speak the words, we do not think, but they are thought through us. What will be, and I'll return to that, a point of contention and discussion is the way in which Heidegger, and so this is where Derrida will intervene a little critically, just seems to say that the animals, so that's where Derrida somehow, and here I am going to rapidly mention the text. You have it, right? You can see it. Yeah, the text by my friend Jennifer Anna Gossetti-Ferenczi, who is not only a wonderful reader of Heidegger, but a very critical reader of Heidegger. And this essay in the collection on Understanding Derrida, Understanding Modernism, and I just send you to it, but she is a superb writer who has more recently different books on existentialism, but she has also an excellent book on German modernism. So what it means to talk about modernism in German literature, and there is indeed a whole field, you might say. But what she shows here is how Derrida takes up many elements of Heidegger, and I insisted on that because I really think personally that Derrida is a Heideggerian, but one could say that as with Hegel, you have the right-wing Hegelians and the left-wing Hegelians. The left-wing Hegelians tend to be either Marx or the socialists, Feuerbach and people like that. The right-wing Hegelians are theologians or people like Carl Schmitt, try to think of the state as such. And with the Heideggerians, you have the right-wing Heideggerians and the left-wing Heideggerians, and Derrida is clearly a left-wing Heideggerian, somebody who points out certain holes, certain moments of blindness in Heidegger. One of them is the question of the animal, and then we'll return to it. But here you have, yesterday we talked a little bit about difference. You have another, I'll return to difference, but that very early margins of philosophy in which you have the little text called difference, is older than the ontological difference, which is Heidegger's concept of the truth of being, for it involved the play of a trace which no longer belongs to the horizon of being, but whose play transports and encloses the meaning of being, the play of the trace, or the difference which has no meaning and is not, which does not belong, a sort of earlier pre-ontological neuter. We'll return later to the conversation with Gadamer. Gadamer, who is also a disciple of Heidegger, but is a phenomenologist and thinks of poetry quite differently when Gadamer reads Celan. And in the second hour, I'll mention the dialogue with Gadamer. What I want to say here is that, so as Jennifer very acutely sees, the main difference between Derrida and Heidegger is, so you saw that Heidegger pushes you to seeing poetry as revealing both the open of the world, how a subject we can be open to the world, and how language functions. How do they work together? And so what Derrida sees, and he's totally right here, Derrida identifies the connection in Heidegger's view of language about gathering, origin, university, and unity. Well, this is where they part ways. Indeed, gathering for Heidegger is one of the meanings of what he sees in the Greek word of logos. Logos, legein, in a famous analysis of logos that actually Lacan translated into French in a very original manner. Heidegger tries to understand logos in Greek, meaning discourse, word, language, as in German lesen, to read, to put, and to gather. To gather something that would be dispersed. Derrida, as you now, I think, understand, on the contrary, insists upon ungathering, dispersion. And this is what he says about Heidegger. Everything concurs and converges toward the point. The site is always the site of a gathering. Das Versammelnde, this definition of site, besides implying the recourse to an original meaning in the determined language, govern the whole course of the Erörterung, meaning the analysis of the poem. The privilege granted to unicity and to indivisibility in situating the Gedicht of what Heidegger called a great poet, great insofar as is related to that unicity of gathering and resist the forces of dissemination or dislocation. And so, indeed, for Heidegger, there is the possibility of reading a poem as meaning something. And of course, if Derrida recognizes that Heidegger understands polysemy in language, nevertheless, indeed, he always returns to what he sees as the main meaning of the poem. Derrida charges that to Heidegger, any poetic polysemy must let itself be gathered in a higher university, in the oneness of harmony. And this is here perhaps the difference between the Heideggerian heart and the Derridian heart. The Heideggerian heart is a heart that gathers in a sort of recollection, almost religious. The Derridian heart is a disseminating heart, is a more Hegelian heart, a heart that opens itself onto the workings of nature and, in a way, continues pumping a sort of blood that would be the blood of the world. And so the question is, of course, the role of language here. If both Heidegger and Derrida insist that there is language, that as language, the word, in a way, the life of the word, is in essence spectral. It repeats itself as itself and is every time other. There is a sort of spectral virtualization in the being of the word, in the very being of grammar. And so for Derrida, much more than for Heidegger, although Heidegger is constantly talking about etymologies, Derrida insists on what he calls spectral errancy. Spectral, why? Because for him, language is also the carrier of all the ancient meanings that have been forgotten. And this is, in a way, the Freudian view of language. Language carrying the weight of all those Bahnungens, but not only ours, but those of the past, those of our families, those of our national and international traumas of wars, of horrible moments of murder and the Holocaust and all that, or the mistreatment of the animals and so on, or the treatment of human beings as animals. All this is part of the spectrality of language. And it is also a language that explodes into the world and that cannot be simply recollected, something that is untranslatable, ungraspable, unreadable, which prevents the closure of interpretation. And so, and he sees, so Jennifer Ferenczi see this as connected with a critique of Derrida's critique of how Heidegger sees the animal as limited, Weltarm. We'll talk briefly about this. And she said, just as poetry exposes the spectrality of language, the animal illuminates for Derrida the heterogeneity at the heart of human subjectivity. So it is an animal that crosses boundaries, and in which we have this in the animal, that therefore I am, and it's been noted by all readers of that last posthumous book that it's full of readings of poems. And so here again, we return to the language from the heart, associated with a poem, and the cat in this Derrida's own cat, the story of the cat. Remember, we talked about this, and when Derrida feels that he has been seen naked by his cat, can the cat look at him, or can he look at the cat looking at him and understand what is happening? So I want to stop here because this would be a little too long, and we've covered a lot of ground with a lot of Heidegger on Rilke, and you may not be that familiar, but if you have questions, please don't hesitate to ask.
Yeah, please feel free to unmute yourself or ask a question, or you could, of course, put it in the chat box. I think the chat to everyone in meeting should work. So just try that once if you want to directly pose a question to Professor Rabate. Yeah.
Well, if there is no question, that's not a problem, because we have reached the end of the first hour, and I understand that all this is a little surprising in a sense. All those texts. What I want simply to say here, it may not be obvious to all of you, is that when Derrida is saying poetry, how to define poetry? Poetry is defined by the request, the wish. So it's both a law and a desire. You must memorize me, sort of dialogue. The poem tells you, learn me by heart. Okay. This could be seen as very different from the simplistic reduction of Derrida to I see a good question. Very good. Yes, thank you. So what is often seen as Derrida attack on phonocentrism, because a poem, when we memorize a poem, We don't write it, but yes, we do at the same time. See, that's a strong insight of Derrida. By memorizing the poem, we write it without paper, without a pen. We write it in ourselves. See, so it's a good way of understanding. And so yes, how is the heart related to what in new materialism is called affect? It is, and for me, it's not only in new materialism, it's what I call affect theory. It's something that I have written a lot about in the last 10 years. Affect theory is also, I would argue, so I have argued that there is a Lacanian theory of affect, even though Lacan in the 60s was dismissive, facing what he saw as sentimentalism in affect theory. There is in Freud a theory of affect. It is a concept of Freud, affect. And it's a complicated theory, but it is indeed close to the theory of affect. And it is, you're right to point to a materialist. It is a materialist theory of affect. Affect as inscription. So for me, a good reading of Freud will make you a reading that has been somehow honed with the dialectical subtlety of Derrida, will make you understand how Freud talks about affect. Does Derrida suggest that poetry can improve the happiness of life and effectively bring meaning to life? Yes, I would say yes. If by happiness we mean an opening to the world, if you want. It is rather surprising, at least that I would say, if you read the modernist canon, the poems that are very strong are generally about sad topics. Mourning, one of the greatest poems, I would say, in the English language, Lycidas by Milton, is about the death of a friend of his, and so on. And yet it reaches amazing heights and so on. And Mallarmé, at least for the French, the most amazing poems, I would say, in the French language are Mallarmé's tombs, tombeaux. Mallarmé writing about Verlaine, about Baudelaire, about Edgar Poe, writing the tombstone for those models for him. Yet he finds extraordinary phrases there. So happiness, in that sense, implies being aware of suffering in life. And so this is what poetry can do and change you by opening your own mind and body together. And this is something that Arthur Rimbaud, also an amazing French poet, would conclude before he abandoned poetry. He said poetry had to be the soul and the body together somehow. And if you can have the soul and the body together, you understand that the soul may be immortal, but the body dies. And we put them together exactly in that experience that Rilke described as the open. What Derrida's notion about the epic poem will become much more difficult to learn by heart. Yes, that's a good question. Derrida was aware of Poe. I don't know whether you know, there's a wonderful little text by Edgar Allan Poe, who says you can only, good poetry should be learned by heart. Poe had also the same principle. You cannot learn a long epic poem by heart. Therefore, an epic poem is a contradiction. A good poem should be a short poem, 1 page, maximum, 2 pages, and so on. What to do with these long epics, and so on. And it's true that it's harder to memorize an epic poem. However, as you may know, and at least I know this from my own family, having had in my family a few uncles and granduncles who were all dabblers in poetry. They were not very good poets, but they had memorized entire epics. It's another century, it's another generation, actually, almost 2 centuries ago, something that you had in France at the end of the 19th century. We know that in other periods of time, if we think of the world from which James Joyce comes, to be a poet, an official poet in ancient Ireland, it was simple. You had to memorize a number of lines, and you had exams, and you had the first stage was 20,000 lines, and then 50,000 lines, and then 80,000 lines, and so on. There was a moment when people would spend years and years memorizing those things just to be called official poets, Ollavs in Irish, if you know, in Gaelic, Lollave or Ves. There was that tradition in many cultures. In the Renaissance, people would memorize a lot and so on. However, for many reasons, maybe because our memories have changed and we are not educated, we are not trained, we don't know how to do this. We now tend to say, it's already very good if I can remember a sonnet. Okay. And the sonnet has replaced the epic as this model Derrida is looking at. Obviously, when he talks about the hedgehog is a sonnet, not an epic. So the epic is a boa constrictor or a crocodile, but the hedgehog is a sonnet. I think it's a small animal. It's not an epic poem. Does Derrida make a distinction between object and thing when saying that poetry is thing? Yes, absolutely. Although he doesn't insist on this, but Derrida has read the famous essay by Heidegger on the thing, and I think he leaves this to Lacan. Lacan has made an art of das Ding and so on. So this is why Derrida doesn't touch so much on this idea of the thing, and he might see. I'm not sure here. I don't think that Derrida has actually touched upon this, but I think that Derrida would try to deconstruct Lacan's theory of the thing, but he knows this, and indeed, clearly, for Heidegger, poetry transforms an object into a thing. Yes. Confession is also a moment of transformation, conversion. This is the question of conversion that is so interesting. That the same holds for poetry, that the learning by heart leads to a certain transformation for the person reading, memorizing it. Yes, I would say yes. Maybe I am too utopian or too optimistic, but I think that if you write an important text or an important poem, you hope that this poem will change people who will read it, simply. Does it mean a conversion that may be a little too hubristic, because a conversion, I mean, the danger of, wanting to convert people generally has a certain religious element of fundamentalism, and I am the only one to be right, and you have to understand my point of view, otherwise you're stupid, and so on. That's a little the danger in the ideology of conversion. So here, this is a tricky term, but I think there is indeed a little bit that desire, a transformation, conversion. As you know, in English, conversion is a little loaded if we think of it in the colonial context. We know very well how colonialism worked, European colonialism, at least, maybe not other colonialisms. I don't think Chinese colonialism had exactly the same idea of converting, but we know that European exportations of Jesuits and other missionaries to the New World, as soon as they succeeded in planting themselves a few decades later, you would see the merchants and then the army trying to invade the country. But I think it is true that fundamentally what Derrida is trying to describe is the way in which, if you have been struck by a poem, what I like is that he's not talking about poetry from the point of view of the poet, but from the point of view of the reader, and the reader who is affected by important poems. See, and I think we can say, oh, it would be more interesting to have somebody who is a poet, but surprisingly, it's quite rare that poets will explain exactly how they write, why, because, and I'll return to this, and I didn't have time to mention Valéry, but Derrida meditates a lot on Valéry. But I suppose you don't really know Valéry, who is probably not read in India, and very, I would say, rarely read in France anymore, unhappily. He's a great poet. And he's the French equivalent, I would say, of Rilke, but with his own language, his own problems, and so on. And Valéry was often seen as a formalist. And he tries to explain how to compose a poem and so on. But fundamentally, Valéry will say, in a sort of, I would say, humility, that he leaves to the reader the choice of the meaning of the poem. The meaning doesn't belong to the author, which I think is where Derrida stands. That is, we don't need to take the author's point of view to have a sense of what is meant. Heidegger, you will note, if you know that Heidegger may not agree with that fully, because he tries to quote as many statements by Rilke, by Trakl, the poems he knows well. He tries to see what they say about their own activity. So seems to defer to their sense of how they were. But again, with Heidegger, as with Alain Badiou, you have this way of taking all the signifiers and then reassembling them. I have a question. As views of Derrida reading poetry, contrary contrary to his theory of deconstruction, since it takes away the pleasure of reading a poem. No, I don't think so. First of all, I would say there is no theory of deconstruction. Deconstruction is not a theory, and that's important to note. I haven't had time to speak about that, but deconstruction is a certain practice of reading. So that's why deconstruction, whenever Derrida tried to define deconstruction, he gives you 10 definitions, and 3 or 4 are mutually contradictory. So you cannot say theory, deconstruction mean da 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 da. And then in Derrida, the pleasure, what is the pleasure of reading a poem? See, he is trying to say it has to be more than pleasure. And here, as a neo-Lacanian too, I would say a really important poem is something that touches your jouissance. So jouissance for Lacan means pleasure and pain, see? Or beyond pleasure, or in Rilke's terms, beyond life, beyond the human, beyond the animal, and so on. So a really important poem is not like enjoying the beauties, oh, nice rhymes, a beautiful terza rima, like Dante, beautiful echoes, and so on. Yeah, that is nice. That is the pleasure of reading a poem. But, I think I quoted Roland Barthes at the beginning, in a very important text by Roland Barthes, The Pleasure of the Text. Barthes, who was a hedonist, one might say, also talks about the text of jouissance. And so for Derrida, one has to go beyond the pleasure, and we'll see this with Paul Celan. When you read Paul Celan, you can see that Celan, who had an extraordinary facility as a young man, tried to go beyond that and give you texts that are not so pleasing to the ear, to the eye, that are difficult, that are hard, that make you work, but to go beyond pleasure towards that confrontation with a certain jouissance. So, question, poetry written from the heart, from the poet's perspective, and learned by heart, from the reader's perspective, is an interesting concept. We agree. Almost as if passing the wounds and creating an ecosystem of shared wounds. Yes, I like that. That's exactly it. Exactly. When Derrida conceptualizes poetry as a hedgehog, the hedgehog wounds, but is self-wounded. Is he also suggesting that the reader and the poet are both wounded beings in their reading and writing poetry? Yes. What Derrida is giving you that little analogy, that little parable, that fable. It's sort of fable, like, La Fontaine, Aesop's fables. See all those animals that interact, and a poem is like a hedgehog that you find on the side of the road. Let's say you may have hit the hedgehog with your car, or you just see a hedgehog wounded, or you don't know, because the hedgehog, as you, yeah, I forgot to mention, for those of you, I guess, do you have hedgehogs in India? Is that an animal that is, okay, you do, right? Okay, good. I mean, one of the obvious, I forgot to mention it, one of the obvious reasons why it takes a hedgehog is that it becomes a little ball. See, when the hedgehog is either wounded or just caught by a human being, they become a little ball. And at times, it's a little like what you have only in America, I think. I discovered that when I came to live in America, the opossum, the opossum pretend to be dead if you find an opossum. I had one in my garden, and I thought it was dead, but it was not dead. Very surprising. Really, they play dead. But the hedgehog is a little ball. So this image shows that when you look at a poem, let's say you open the New Yorker or all those magazines in which you have poetry, the TLS, of a little poem. You may glance at it. You're not interested in poetry in a regular manner, and you just suddenly one day you find 10 lines, a sonnet, a page, and you look distractedly, and something catches you, a little like with the punctum of Roland Barthes, and you're caught by it. Wow, I want to memorize it. This is something I want to. So, according to Derrida, it is because you have your affects that have been somehow defined, seen, and that find an equivalent, a verbal equivalent that helps you live better, even if it is about sadness. And so indeed, I agree completely. The reader and the poet are both wounded beings in their reading and writing poetry. Very good definition. That's wonderful. Thank you, Patici. And Arnab, the unity through recollection that Heidegger writes about is written in his yearning for logocentricity by Derrida. Yes. Can this difference between Heidegger and Derrida might be called as that between being as becoming and the flux of becoming respectively? I think this is a Deleuzian question here. And I would say not really, not really. And why? Why? It would be a very long discussion, but I don't know whether Arnab, you know Nietzsche, but
Yes,
for
Professor.
for Heidegger, so great. For Heidegger, as you may know, there was an intense confrontation with Nietzsche in the 30s. And one of the things that Heidegger, you might say, deconstructs before Derrida is the Nietzschean idea of being as becoming. And interestingly, Heidegger says, no, this doesn't work. Being as becoming is not good thinking. It's just metaphysics. And so for Heidegger, this idea of Sein in German, that he writes in the later moment of his philosophy with a Y sign or a type under erasure, is not, to say that it is becoming is an anthropological distortion for him. And of course, someone like Deleuze would disagree with Heidegger here. And for Derrida, it is not, so in that sense, Derrida is, I think, more Heideggerian than Deleuzian, and would not say that all this can be solved by the question of the eternal return of the same, the flux, the Heraclitean flux, Pantare, and all that. No. Here, it's interesting that there would be a certain delimitation between Derrida, Heidegger on one side, even though they disagree on many things. On this, they agree that whatever we call being, transcendence, the other, and so on in their languages, never God, but not far from God for Heidegger, as we know, at least a negative theology for Derrida, or a Jewish God, and so on. It's not becoming. No, no. Okay, well, thank you very much for all those wonderful questions. I see that you are getting it. All my thanks. So we'll take a very rapid break of 5 minutes and then meet again in, for me, it's 9:30 for me. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. See you soon. Yeah.
Yes.
Could we take this opportunity to do that quick photo shoot we have to do? So may I request everyone to switch on their video for a while as I take a screenshot, and then we could go back to the ghost mode. Okay, perfect. I can see more faces. Yes, please. Some more would be wonderful. Thank you. Okay, still waiting for others to populate the rest of the screen. Yeah, some more maybe. I feel like a school headmaster doing this. I'm really sorry, but it's part of the whole structure that I'm supposed to do this. Okay, I think we'll go for this. Okay. Right, perfect. Let me see if we have missed anybody in the second window. Just give me a second. No, we haven't. Fine. Thank you very much. You can, I mean, you can all take like a bio break and we can come back in for 5 minutes. Yeah, thank you.
Hello.
Hi, Jean-Michel. I think we can get started.
Good. Very good. Excellent. Okay. So I am going to talk about porcelain, and I begin. So once I think it's important to begin with the portrait of porcelain, because I have to say that I had facing porcelain an experience quite similar to that of Jacques Derrida. I happened to be a student at the École Normale Supérieure in the fall of '68. And as I was, one of the languages I was working on was German, we were a very small group, 5 maybe, first-year students, and we had classes with Paul Celan. And we didn't know who he was at all. And he was a little older than this, but looked exactly like that. And an older man, very melancholy, rather depressed, but a wonderful teacher. We loved him. But he had a teaching style that was, I would say, quite conventional. Each time we take one page of German and translate it, just like that. And a few times we tried to engage him, to invite him to have drinks with us. After, no, he didn't want to. And so in order to break the tedium, one day I had an idea, and I pretended not to understand a very basic word in German, the word for horse, Pferd, and which was in a compound. In German, you have many compounds. And then Paul Celan woke up, I would say, and said, "What? You don't know that?" And then for 10 minutes was at the blackboard, writing frantically all the words for horse in all the languages he knew, and with definitions and dictionaries that he had memorized. And then at the end of this, he turned to me and he said, "And of course, you know how horse was said in Picard in the 18th century." I thought he was joking. Picard is a French dialect that was totally obliterated after the French Revolution, and I had no idea about Picard. And I said, no, what is Picard? I didn't even know. I said, "What? You don't know, but you're French." And I am not, and I know it. And so we realized, to our absolute surprise and terror, that Paul Celan was somebody who would read a dictionary and remember it. And so this is a little bit some expression of how he wrote poetry. And of course, he had many languages. Derrida, I knew this later on, talking about Celan with him, almost at the same time only, discovered that he was the colleague of Paul Celan. Derrida told me that about, I think in late, maybe even later, in early '69, just before his death, thanks to a common friend, Peter Zondi, Derrida discovered, and thanks to the main person, Lortolari, he was called Lortolari, in charge of German at the École Normale Supérieure, said to Derrida, "But you don't know, you are the colleague of the most important poet in German, and perhaps the most important poet of the century." And Derrida said, "What?" And then he had the opportunity to meet Celan and talk with him. But Celan, as some of you may know, committed suicide in 1970, in the spring of '70, and threw himself in the Seine. But we could say that he was indeed a very depressed man. But we had then, after that, we would go on with that little trick of asking about a word. And then it was like a sort of frenzy, Paul Celan. He knew so much about words. He loved words so much. I think to be a good poet is perhaps a precondition. I have to say another little detail, and some of you may not know it. I'll stop my sharing here. No. And I will not show you a picture, but surprisingly, at the École Normale Supérieure, and at times we would take one for the other, there were two people who looked very similar in terms of face, Louis Althusser and Paul Celan. Both had the face of pain and melancholia, I would say, inscribed on their being. Of course, Celan was different, was a taller man and a little more reflexive. Althusser was more shuffling around, but both, the common point was that, as you may know, unhappily, poor Althusser murdered his wife, and Celan several times tried to murder his wife. So that was a common point. And they were both in and out of hospitals and so on, and both really geniuses within the domain of poetry and the domain of philosophy. But I'll give you then here an example of what I meant earlier by saying that Celan was was too well known for one poem, and here. Okay, this so to continue my autobiographical narrative, I have to say the year I took those classes with Paul Celan, I didn't know who he was at all. I thought he was just a teacher at the École Normale Supérieure. Then I spent a year in London. Then I spent a year in Hamburg. When I was in Hamburg, I just got a little book called Paul Celan, Gewählte Gedichte, selected poems in German. And I saw one of the first one was this Fugue of the Todesfuge. Wow, what a poem. It is a poem about the Holocaust. And it is so powerful. It's much better in German. But that poem was already famous in Germany when I got it. It's a beautiful meditation on the camps, the death camps, the fact that Celan lost his parents during the war. They were killed by the Nazis, sent to a camp. And while he had just gone out, he had told them to hide, but they didn't. And he managed to survive and to hide and so on. And so, see, death comes as a master from Germany. This is a poem that was indeed memorized a lot. And I have to say that it is one of the poems that made Adorno change his mind about the possibility of writing after the Holocaust. This is now a later poem, and I give it to you. So it's called Shibboleth, and this is the poem one of the poems that Derrida glosses at some length in the little book called Shibboleth. See, you also have, so the passage that Derrida is always discussing is this, put your flag at half-mast, memory, at half-mast for today and always. Heart, reveal yourself here too, here in the middle of the market. Shout out the shibboleth to the foreigner of February, no pass around. We'll see what it means, but it's just to show that the later Celan is extremely enigmatic, elliptical, and that the sort of trope, and one is ashamed of repeating it too often, that the paradox and it is not an uncommon paradox, but in Celan's case, it was stronger as a paradox, with that Celan's first language was Romanian, not German. And he started writing in Romanian and then became a German poet. I have to say that I first couldn't realize that, but I have to say that indeed Celan had a sort of a little accent in German that I realized only later on, my German being not so good then. Then I realized retrospectively that it had a little accent. And I will just here rapidly use a text by my friend Josh Schuster. You can see it, huh? Yes. Broken singularities. And so what Derrida told me was that he too was told that Celan was the most important poet. And indeed, he started reading him and he then kept on writing on Celan. However, Celan was writing in the language of the enemy, as it were. And a lot has been more recently written about why did Celan not become a Romanian poet? Obviously, it's not simply because he felt that German was a more universal language, but because his culture really was German more than Romanian. And he came to live in Paris and he married his wife, who was an artist, Gisèle Lestrange, and then was at the end of his life bilingual, but his language for poetry was German. He was recognized by the number, he got many prizes. One of very important texts is the Meridian that he gave for the Büchner Prize. And so when he died, Celan was already recognized as a very important poet, but as often been said, perhaps the guilt of having survived his parents, or simply the difficulty of being in France and not so well known, even at the École Normale Supérieure, he was not honored that he should have been. Was given this very ancillary task of teaching first-year students in a small dark room and so on. Contributed to his depression and fatal decision to commit suicide. Writing about Celan, Derrida also mentioned the fact that Peter Sondy, who became a close friend, who was in Germany at the time but came from Hungary, also committed suicide. So there was this, it's also the moment, if you remember, what Sylvia Plath committed suicide. Many important poets committed suicide in 60s. And what Derrida nevertheless discusses is this idea that reading Celan, one has to talk about the singularity. And so this is the other element that Derrida insists upon. See, this is the poem I was showing. 13th of February, Shibboleth roused in the heart's mouth with you, peuple de Paris, no passaran. Celan's no passaran was the slogan in Spanish used by the Popular Front against fascist forces during the Spanish Civil War. So, suggesting solidarity in the tradition of leftist resistance. The Shibboleth gathers several languages that are untranslated: German, Hebrew, French, Spanish. Shibboleth, what is that term? I don't know whether you know this, but it comes from a passage in the Bible in Judges, so he gives it 12:6. The word used by, there was a war between two tribes in what is Palestine, the Gileadites against the Ephraimites, defeated into the red. The Gileadite caught a number of fleeting Ephraimites who were forced to identify themselves by trying to pronounce the word shibboleth, which refers to the part of a plant containing grains. The Ephraimites could not pronounce the sh phonem. When they were discerned, they were killed. So they were asked to pronounce that word. If they couldn't do it, they were executed. The term shibboleth has since circulated as a term that refers to the separateness and otherness of the Jewish people. At the same time, in American English, a shibboleth is also seen as a sort of word that can be used to explain whatever. A linguistic marker of a community, but also, for Derrida, a signifier for poetry itself. And indeed, he tries to understand what Celan means when he says that poetry is by necessity a unique instance of language. In the 20th century, a modern re-instantiation of the shibboleth, I don't know whether you know this, it's a little detail of Hispaniola. There was a war between Haiti and the neighbors, the Dominican Republic. The Dominican Republic has Spanish as its language, Haiti French as its language, and during that terrible war, that was also a huge slaughter of the Haitians who had come through the other side. They were asked to pronounce the word parsley, I cannot pronounce it myself. I would have been executed. If the Haitian could not pronounce it, they were killed. Same thing. Only those who had learned Spanish from the earliest age could pronounce it well, and so on. So what you can see in shibboleth is this idea of military violence, solidarity, and this sort of cipher. And I just go fast through Schuster's essay, because the difficulty with Celan is that he often cuts words, has extremely condensed coinings, he invents words, and one can say that for Derrida, he says this: I believe that all Celan's poems remain in a certain way indecipherable, retain some indecipherability, and so he insists upon the fact that the poem resists. It's as if the hedgehog remain closed upon itself, or that you have to open it strongly with a certain violence. And so one can say that in Celan, there is fundamentally a meditation on the Holocaust and on death. And as Celan wrote in the Meridian, so I was mentioning in 1960, there can be no doubt that the poem today, shows a strong inclination towards falling silent. The poem takes its position at the edge of itself. In order to be able to exist, it without interruption calls and fetches itself from its now no longer back into as always. So, but as he says, the poem wants to reach the other. It needs this other. It needs a vis-a-vis. It searches it out and addresses it. So this is how one can say that we have this central idea of an absolute singularity of poetry, and we'll see how in the discussion with Gadamer, Derrida understands this. So let me just share this. It's a text called Rams. and plus the plus the plus the screen. Sorry, disappeared from. I'll have to redo. Sorry, technical problem here. Okay. Because I don't see. I'll have, I think, to leave you for a minute and relancer. Sorry, the Zoom disappeared. I will have to disappear from my screen.
Okay. Sure.
Here it is. Oof. It had, yeah. Okay. And so I now will find Rams. So it is a conversation with Gadamer. I don't know whether you know, I think I mentioned him earlier. Gadamer is also a philosopher who was inspired by Heidegger, and simply I cannot seem to be sharing this. Okay.
Is it a screen share problem?
Yeah, that's it. I have it now.
Yeah, now.
Yeah, I have it. Okay. But it's a very tiny, you probably see it as a very, very small. Why is that? Okay. Can you see it as a, you can see the page now?
Not
Yeah.
yet. Maybe if you.
Not yet? Not yet. Okay.
Perhaps.
So normally you should see it, they say. Why is that? Okay. I see. And now you have it. Yes? Can you see it now?
Not yet.
No? Okay. Technical problems. So sorry, if I can't, I'll.
No, it's all right. What I was suggesting, since I have this,
you have it.
Screen sharing, and you could direct me where to pause and what sections to go over.
Yeah.
It's
you have it, yeah, in the folder. I mean, the file on Celan.
to the
And
folder, but I also have it in my computer.
Okay, partagé. Okay, I have it. I think. Okay. Finally,
Perfect.
I have it. You have it?
Yes.
Oof. Okay, sorry for this. My computer does weird things at times. So, it is a moment in which we see both Gadamer and Derrida in a dialogue about Celan, and Gadamer had written a sort of complex analysis describing a few lines in the poem, the four-finger furrow. So one has to remember that indeed Celan's writing is so dense and elusive and cryptic that you have, especially in German, the whole industry of reading Celan and finding interpretation. And Gadamer is one of the best. He has a nice little book on old Celan. And Derrida is, in this, he says, I more than the indecision itself, I admire the respect Gadamer shows for the indecision. The indecision seems to interrupt or suspend the decipherment of reading, though in truth, it ensures its future. Indecision keeps attention forever in suspense, breathless, That is to say, keeps it alive, alert, vigilant, ready to embark on a wholly other path, to open itself to whatever may come, listening faithfully, giving ear to that other speech. Such indecision hangs upon the breath of the other speech and of the speech of the other, right where the speech might still seem unintelligible, inaudible, and untranslatable. And indeed, with Celan, one can say that there is a sort of game, we'd say, with the limits of language, and very often using all the potentialities of German, and the fact that in German you can modify any noun by adding un at the beginning, which is not so easy, even in English, doesn't work so well, or you can break the a verb into its main components and so on. And so, as you can see, Derrida sends us to its truth and method, one of Gadamer's best books about what might be called hermeneutics and theory of hermeneutics based on a certain phenomenology of reading. And in that book, Gadamer underlines what he called the boundlessness of the dialogue. The boundaries of language, he names twice this infinite process. On the one hand, the infinite process characterizes dialogue in general. From the hermeneutical standpoint, dialogue is never finished until it has led to a real agreement. And so for Habermas, hermeneutics posits a certain dialogue between the poet and the reader, and somehow they would reach a certain agreement if the poem can be read. And on the other hand, the infinite process is named again 2 pages further on, in order this time to characterize the interminable dialogue of the translator with himself. And you can see, you can imagine that having quoted these sentences, Derrida will, of course, disagree with all these terms somehow. And he goes again, so that's interesting, through Plato, the Phaedrus, the discussion of writing. We talked about that. The abandonment, which appears to deprive the poem of a father, to separate and emancipate it from a father, would expose calculation to the incalculability of interrupted filiation. This term, we will return to it, incalculability. You noted that it was already in Heidegger. It is a Heideggerian term, fundamentally. That is that if there is something like poetry, it should be on the side of the incalculable. It is the openness to something that is unshielded, wounded, open, and so on. There, Derrida and Heidegger agree. And if, as he seems to suggest here, we assume that the aim of poetry is to establish a dialogue and that we have to agree, then we lose the incalculable. See, we lose the risk. We lose the possibility. And so here we have what he finds in Celan is this idea of a certain unreadability of the poem. So this is what is foregrounded. And he quotes a poem by Celan. Unlesbarkeit. See, in German, un, les, to read, bar, the possibility, barkeit, the unreadability of this world. All things twice over, alles doppelt, literally everything doubled. Just a bit further on, one hesitates to identify the shoe, who this poem apostrophizes, no matter whom, more than one, the poem itself, the poet, the reader, the abyssal profundity of this or that other singularity, forever encrypted, or an entirely other God, you or me, du in dein tiefst geklemmt, you in your deepest completely locked up, literally. this leads to one sentence that Derrida will gloss systematically. uh, and that is so beautiful indeed, that can, in a sense, I would say, sum up Celan's main idea. Uh, Here, he quotes it in simply in German, and he doesn't translate it. Die Welt ist fort. Ich muss dich tragen. The world is gone. I have to carry you. Just that sentence. Derrida, one can say that in the same way as we see Lacan endlessly retranslating Freud's Wo es war, soll ich werden, where it was, there must I become or arrive, famous sentence of Freud, that Lacan glosses, retranslates in a sort of obsessive Heideggerian manner. The way Heidegger would take one sentence in Heraclitus and then translate again and again and again. Derrida did this with that apparently simple sentence. For once, we have something that is not so difficult to read. The world has disappeared, therefore I have to carry you, tragen, simply. Uh, and so this is the poem that is given in German. And as you can see here, wogegen normally is one word. Rennt nicht an? Where to? Where against does he not run? Die Welt ist vor, ich muss dich tragen. Here we have italics because this is how Derrida insists on these words. He says this: when I first discovered the poem, I confess this as a possible misdeed. My fascinated reading pounced right away on the last line. By hypothesis that I will tell you later, I avidly appropriated for myself a number of significations, like so many scenes, staging, and possible worlds, like so many addresses in which the I and the you were able to light upon anyone and anything in the world, beginning with the poet, the poem, or the receiver, either in the history of literature or in life, between the world of the poem and the world of life, even beyond the world that is no more. I thus tried first to translate the last line into French. Its grammatical present carries within it more than one time or tense. Die Welt ist fort. The world has gone. Already, the world has left us. The world is no more. The world is far off. The world is lost. The world is lost from sight. The world is out of sight. The world has departed. Farewell to the world. The world has died, and so on. Do you see how Derrida gives you a good example of an endless translation, something that says the world, literally in German, it's even simpler. I don't know whether you will recognize here, but fort is exactly the term. And so to go back to Freud, in a famous passage of Beyond the Pleasure Principle, Freud recognizes in actually his grandson the principle of difference in language when the little boy is left alone and invents a game. And this game is, he hears Freud, oh, ah, oh, ah. And then Freud translates, fort, da, fort, da. You can say in German, the entire metaphysics of philosophy is contained in those two words. Fort means away, and da means here. Fort, da, for Freud, was a way of understanding that this little boy was in fact replaying the pain of the mother's absence. The little boy was left alone and found consolation in being able to use language and say, fort da, fort and was playing with a little toy, hiding it, catching it, hiding it, catching it, so as to somehow replay and overcome the sadness of the mother's disappearance. You find this in this poem, obviously. Die Welt ist fort, the world is away, the world is not here anymore, then I have to carry you. And so Derrida, I cannot reproduce here the many pages of retranslation, but of these simple terms. And we know that in many seminars, he returns to that sentence that became a sort of mantra for him. And indeed, I would say for me as well, when I think of Celan, and that I know how sad I am not to have been able to share his sadness with me or with us. And we tried, I have to say. We really tried because we liked him a lot. We respected him. And there was no way of breaching the kind of gap, the isolation, and I think the depression he was in. Derrida goes on, I will not unfold here, I will not have the time to do so, and I've attempted to do so as well, protocols of an apparently theoretical or methodological nature. I will say nothing directly of the unsurmountable, but always abusively surmounted border between, on the one hand, indispensable formal approaches, thematic, polythematic approaches that are attentive, as any hermeneutic must be, to the explicit and implicit folds of meaning, the ambiguities and overdetermination, the rhetoric, to the intentional meaning of the author, to all the idiomatic resources of the poet, of the language, and so forth. And on the other hand, a disseminal reading, writing, that endeavoring to take all this into account, to account for all this, to respect its necessity, also directs itself towards an irreducible remainder or excess. The excess of this remainder escapes any gathering in a hermeneutic. This hermeneutic is made necessary, also possible, by the excess. Likewise, excess here makes possible, among other things, the trace of the poetic work, its abandonment or its survival beyond any signatory and any specific reader. Without this remainder, there wouldn't even be the Anspruch, the injunction, the call, the provocation that sings or makes one sing in any poem in what one could with Celan name singbare Rest, in English translated singable remnant, in the title or the incipit of another poem from Attenwende. I like this paragraph because it puts together the need for a hermeneutic. And this is indeed what Gadamer has done very well. It's what you do when you interpret a poem. You think of the methods and the formal approach, the themes, the ambiguities, the we can say the many meanings that every word will contain. We can think of that famous, wonderful book by Empson, Seven Types of Ambiguity, from the 30s, in which Empson looks at many poems and looks at the ambiguity. And we can say that for Derrida, this is more Gadamer and his method. But if we think back to the English tradition, it would be all the techniques of new criticism. I don't know whether you know about new criticism, but Empson, Richards, and many others in the US in the 30s, 40s, and 50s invented what you might call a certain formalism in literary criticism, and they took poetry as, and mostly romantic poetry, as the field they explored, always pointing to the way a poem contains tension, paradoxes, ironies, ambiguity, and so on. But at the same time, they would all try to fold, to wrap up their interpretation in some kind of neat little equivalent of what the poem is for them or was, that is a little container containing as much of the world as possible. On the other hand, the disseminal, so dissemination, another term that Derrida appropriates, in which you have an excess, see, that you go beyond the hermeneutic, you go beyond the possibility of gathering the text. There is always a remainder, as it were, and traces something that looks to the event, the signature, the moment, and things that are therefore harder to share, harder to put in a dialogue between one subject and the other. And so Derrida goes on and systematizes. I cannot go through all of this. The analysis of the poem again returns to that same sentence: the truth of the verdict on the edge of the end of the world. Die Welt ist fort. Ich muss dich tragen. This formal analysis can be taken very far. It must, in fact, but it hardly seemed risky. It belonged to the order of calculable warranties and decidable evidence. It is not the same for the hermeneutical response to the Anspruch. And see, so the again, he ends with this idea of a sort of combining the finite and the infinite. And I want to insist on this because it is something that Alain Badiou has recently, and Alain Badiou, in a sense, has inherited a lot from Derrida, has put forward in his reading of poetry, including Celan. He has a very good chapter on Celan in the recent book translated, The Immanence of Truth, in English, and read Celan like Derrida does, as opening up poetry to infinity. That is to say, differently finite and infinite. It is for us there that, alone in the distancing of the world, the poem hails or blesses, bears, trägt the other. I mean, you. Who is you here? Of course, you can see a simple reading of Celan's famous line would be a Levinasian reading. The Levinasian reading would be, the world has gone, meaning ontology is not available. I cannot say much about the world. What remains is the interaction between subjects, you, and because one can say you, there must be an I. I and you are alone, and I will carry you without a world. But one can say, how can I carry somebody if I cannot walk on the earth? How can I carry? See, that's one of the paradoxes Derrida is attentive to. If there is no ground where I can walk, how can I carry? What does it mean? And so, indeed, in the end, the poem is the you and the I that is addressed to you, but also to any other. And so, I will stop here this too rapid discussion of Celan. Let's say that Celan remains today one of the really important poets of the 20th century. I'm not sure that he's well known in India, but at least I would say in France and in Europe, he's revered. I have many friends who are poets who have tried to translate him, and it's difficult. The interesting thing is that you can, and Derrida actually in Rams and in other texts that are in the little collection on Celan, he will quote 3 or 4 French translators, 3 or 4 American translators, and so on. And I think poetry is like that. Good poetry is endlessly retranslated. Celan was aware that he had reached in some poems sort of not only perfection, but something that goes beyond formal perfection, kind of ethical simplicity, I would say, that is reached beyond the many convolutions of a twisted language. And so this is what Derrida is always trying to do, to combine, in fact, because he respects Gadamer. He's not facing Gadamer. It is a true dialogue, and Gadamer respects Derrida in their exchange. It is not, as I mentioned earlier, the ferocious dialogue with Searle. Derrida did not respect Searle and made fun of him as much as he could. And Searle hated Derrida, and there was no dialogue. Total missed opportunity of a dialogue. I again said that with Lacan, I'm not sure that Derrida respected Lacan so much, even though he made peace with him after the latter's death. But with Gadamer, they share so much. And Derrida recognizes that what Gadamer is doing is fine as a hermeneutic, but he wants to add this kind of excess, the Bataillean moment, you might say, of heterogeneity and something that cannot be simply calculated or caught in a sort of economy. If there are questions here, we can
yes, please.
talk about that.
Free to unmute yourself and speak if you want. I mean, there's no punishment for that. Also write in the chat box if you like.
Yeah.
I was
Yes,
actually
thank you for having put the text on the
yeah.
web. Yeah. The Derrida's writing at Celan in one volume, exactly. You will see these texts, and there's a shibboleth. It begins with shibboleth and a number of conversations, and one conversation in which Derrida says what he had told me that I was surprised. I thought that Derrida knew of who Celan was, and it was really until they had been in the same institution for a number of years side by side, but they didn't know, because Celan was extremely, we say, modest and shy, would not really interact with many people.
Jean-Michel, if I may just quickly ask a question as they take their time to.
Sure.
So, and it's something that has always occurred to me as a sort of ethics of deconstructive reading. If there is, as we were discussing, a practice of reading, deconstruction as a practice of reading, has this ethics in pointing to something that is not decipherable, the singularity, as you were talking about it, right? So I was just wondering whether there is an element of the Benjaminian sacred in that idea of something that cannot be interpreted. And as there is, I would sometimes say a little bit psychoanalytically in his work on resistances, that there's a certain resistance to analysis that is part of the method in that sense. I mean, the deconstructive practice more than a method, maybe. So I was just wondering if you would like to say something about that.
Yes, I think that's a very good point. And in a sense, I see a certain link between that ethical moment and the earlier injunction to learn by heart. Because what Derrida is saying, and I think it has been shown to be quite true, if we think of a very interesting school, the Oulipo of poets like Roubaud, one of the best living French poets today, Jacques Roubaud, belonged to that school Oulipo, Oulipo, and what they were trying to do was a sort of grammar or mathematics of poetry, and with rules, with methods that are quite useful and funny. For instance, there was a method in which you would take any famous sonnet and you would take a dictionary and replace every word by the seventh word in the dictionary following the definition and so on. And then you had another poem that at times was quite funny. However, for Derrida, who doesn't really discuss it in those terms, but it's a simple example, this remains within the domain of the calculable. Of course, there is the element of randomness that you introduce, but if a poem is strong for Derrida, it has to keep something of its singularity. In a sense, you must feel that it is not like what I feel at times when reading too many sonnets by the same author. I was recently working with a friend who has translated Shakespeare's sonnets into French superbly for the Pléiade, Jean-Michel. And so I reread fast all of Shakespeare's sonnets. There are not so many, 180 or something. But when you read them one after the other, you can say, I like this one better, or this one is famous, I recognize this. But then you may read too many of the similar tropes and so on, think, okay, this is fine, but I would need to become a specialist of the Shakespearean sonnet or the Petrarchian sonnet or the Dantean sonnet and so on. And then you understand what a sonnet means, why was this mode of writing, this form, this format invented, what does it say, and so on. And then maybe, so this was my experience, rereading it, there was one sonnet that I didn't understand at all. So what is this? It would be too long now to, and then it's not that I decided to memorize it, but I decided to read it. And then what I did, I looked at all the translations of the sonnets into French, because we had a conversation on Zoom about that. And then I almost memorized it, see, because I didn't understand it. So there was this resistance. And I think Derrida is right there. You must first be able to read something, and without which there wouldn't be any meaning. It needs to make meaning. And at times it generally, for me, and I think for Derrida as well, there's one line or one word maybe, or two lines, a couplet, or half line, whatever. One little thing will resist you and catch you and say, oh, let me look at it better. And then one will want to memorize and chew it. See, chew it doesn't mean interpreting it. Derrida is very suspicious of this idea, and I think it was a little bit the mirage of the structuralists in the 60s. The idea was that, oh, good, we have a great poem by Baudelaire, The Cats, and then we put it on the grid, we see all the determinations, and then all the codes, we pour all the codes, and then good, we've done our business, we are good literary critics, the poem is really laid to rest, as it were. Derrida is totally opposed to that kind of formalist, scientific, neo-scientific reading. This can be done. He says, yes, do it if you want. Do it. Okay. You can even write dissertations and books and so on. And maybe, become a professor of poetics at the College of France, like Valéry ended up doing. But this is not the key. This is a little bit a waste of time. See? So, and then for him, and so this is what he sees in Celan, and Celan did it quite deliberately. Because Celan, I wanted to show you that the earlier work was really in line with more classical forms, the fugue, the sonnet, and so on, the ode. And then it's an explosion on the page. However, it is recognizably poetry, and it's presented as Gedichte. I have a question here. Over the ages, authors and philosophers like Eliot, Robert Pirsig talk about what constitutes excellent in poetry literature, but no one could really define that excellent which makes a text a piece of literature in the sublime sense. does Derrida say anything about this excellence? That's a very good question. I am glad that you mentioned Eliot, because I think Eliot is behind Derrida. That would be my take here. And I remember that, but maybe I'm distorting things a little bit. I think I remember that once we had a conversation about T.S. Eliot. Why? Because, no, I think it is true. Because, no, I remember that. That was, yes, now, okay, it's good to have those excellent questions, because thank you for making me get back a sort of half-forgotten memory. It happened indeed that the year I was at the École Normale Supérieure, my first year, and when I would go to chat with Derrida every week for 1 hour, we had that 1 hour. It was the year when T.S. Eliot was on the reading list of the Agrégation. The Agrégation was for the older students, but I went to their classes and so I read T.S. Eliot with them. And so we discussed T.S. Eliot. And one day I went back to Derrida and I asked about T.S. Eliot, and I just wanted to know whether he had read Eliot. Said, yes, I've read Eliot and I like Eliot. So at that time, people in France were not reading Eliot, I would say, in a political manner, as it has been done in the US. We just thought he was a great poet. So Eliot has really meditated on what constitutes excellence. And I don't know whether you remember, at times he speaks of something like the objective correlative. And what he says fits exactly what Derrida is trying to describe with a slightly different language. What Eliot is saying is that you have a certain inevitability of the literary line or image, because this is an image that combines the we say emotional value of the word and the intellectual value of the word. And this is what he found in poets like Donne. See? For him, one or those he called metaphysical, were called at that time metaphysical poets, people who were writing in English in England at the beginning of the 17th century. John Donne, a lot has been written about him. People who were, John Donne was a Catholic and converted, became a Protestant. The early work of John Donne is mostly, I would say, erotic poetry. And this was one of, and of course, Shakespeare for Eliot were models. So for Eliot, they were able to call up at the same time a sensation and an intellectual complex idea. The idea was sensation, the sensation was idea. And I think this is indeed what Celan is trying to do, see, by often creating something that is so literal that you have to gloss it endlessly. It is a little mystifying, but this excellence is not definable in terms of tropes, rhetorics, meter, and so on. You have, in a way, to go back to a certain personal experience of the world, of your body, of interaction between people, and so on. Derrida is not so much on the side of, evaluation in criticism. I think for most philosophers, and in my experience, philosophers and mathematicians are people who read a lot of poetry, maybe more than people who work on literature, surprisingly. Many of my friends who are mathematicians, at least when I was at the École Normale Supérieure, whenever I talked about poetry, it was with people who were not literary scholars at all. They were mostly philosophers or mathematicians. They had their little canon. And I would say today, excellence in poetry is a very tricky concept, personally, I would say. And there are so many schools, so many ways, and so on. And I would say, so my own experience since for more than 10 years, when I lived in France, I had a little press and called Ulysse Fin de Siècle, and we published a lot of poetry. And I would say that rather than talk about excellence, we would, in order to see whether we agreed, we would talk about the people we really admired, and among those authors, what text we really liked most. And I think this is, in a sense, what constitutes the perhaps contemporary equivalent of excellence. I would say the ideogram, to use a term that Ezra Pound took from China, an ideogram of what constitutes strong poetry. Say, I am moved by so and so and so, and by this and that text and so on. And then I could see very quickly how in our interactions, it was so important to agree on this. And many times we would get texts we did not understand. We did not see why they were written, but we liked something. And then we got in touch with the author, and we were not going to say, this is good, this is bad. We could not say that, of course. But we say, oh, do you like this? Do you like? Yes. And so that's how excellence, and I think excellence should be used indeed, but in a subjective sense, not in an objective sense. For me, this is excellent. I do not think there is anything like absolute excellence. I don't think you can give like end of the year prizes or even a Nobel Prize and so on. As we know, most Nobel Prizes miss the really important writers. In French literature, all the important writers never got a Nobel Prize, with a few exceptions. So you don't give a prize, but there is your concept of excellence. So I have another question from Protici. When Derrida talks about the unreadability of Celan because of heterogeneity or translatability, he does so by reading Celan. That's a good point. By reading Celan in all possible ways, heterogeneous ways, also by translating, he showed this unreadability. Yeah, isn't this already a paradox? Absolutely. It is the paradox. Huh? It is the paradox of translating the untranslatable. And I think this is why we work with poetry. We think that it is impossible to translate, and think the more we think about it, we translate it already. So the paradox is there, but it is, as you may have seen, Derrida is a thinker who progresses through paradoxes. Derrida doesn't call it paradox, nevertheless. This is why I was thinking of new criticism. The new critics, whether British or American, were often insisting on paradox in poetry, or tension, and so on. Derrida will talk about aporia, which is a more philosophical concept. Aporia is used by Plato, and you have the aporetic dialogue. Aporia in Greek means no passage, no way. Poros means the way. Aporos, you cannot go further. And so, if you know a little bit the corpus of Plato's dialogues, you will remember that a number of dialogues are called aporetic dialogues, meaning that you have Socrates and interlocutors, and they don't agree. They cannot find anything. It stops. Aporia. So Derrida works like this. He gives you a paradox, and then he thinks beyond it. And this is what he does, not only with poetry, but more generally. For instance, famous book on giving, on the gift, given time. Derrida begins by showing that the book by Marcel Mauss on the gift doesn't talk about the gift. It talks about economy and exchange, and that the gift is impossible. You cannot give. Or another text that is also quite clear, Politics of Friendship. It takes as a point of departure the famous statement, apocryphal by Aristotle, that he retranslates, and the paradox is, oh, my friends, there are no friends. So Derrida thinks, you might say, it's a certain link with a certain Zen tradition, maybe, of thinking via the paradox. But I think that paradox of translatability or intranslatability is essential to poetry. See? And I think that for me, part of the desire I may have to read poems in the original language is to see, I can have a very good translation, but I will want to see the original language, even if I don't know the language, to even see, even if it is languages that I absolutely cannot read, like Chinese. I want to see how it is and see how many ideograms there are. And if we think of a very paradoxical text like the Tao Te King, that is made up of pure paradoxes, where there is the way, there is no way. Okay, Tao, Dao, Dao in Chinese. What does it mean? If there is a way, there is no way. Many philosopher poets think via paradoxes. Okay, another question. The untranslatability of the shibboleth in the poem creates an excess as reminder, yes, that this poetical opacity as resistant to dialogue between reader and poet point to a private and unique language of the poet. Yes, I say yes, indeed, you're right. There is a private and unique language of the poet, and I think all good poets, or even bad poets, I'd say, stage that private language. In a sense, it's a little like narrating a dream in the morning. We know that only some people manage to make the dreams interesting. Most people are so boring when they tell you your dream, yes, and I was here, Kafka manages to be amazing when he tells you his dreams. How does he do it? That Kafka, or a few others. So, if yet, is this world, as represented by the opaque shibboleth, have as it signified some particular thing, event, phenomenon that is of affective value to the poet? Yes. Or is it something more complex to the poet that remains as an excess? Does this excess have a coherence in the inner world of the poet? This is a great question, and we could, I think you are suggesting a very long discussion. First of all, maybe we can distinguish between poets who trust perhaps more their unconscious and those who are more formalist and know what they want to do. And here perhaps I would say, if you take Shakespeare and if you read all the sonnets, you can see that in Shakespeare there was a sort of mastery of a certain game. One might say a combinatory. And this is why in some languages, especially French or Italian, rhymes are so important. And I'd say the amazing genius of someone like Mallarmé is that he always uses rhymes, but unexpected rhymes. And at times he will invent words. In one case, famous case, in the famous sonnet in X, invents a word that sounds like a Greek word, but he needed an extra word in X. So there is this element of formalism in poetry, but I'd say that in my experience, every poet will know that there is something that will escape from her or his mastery over the text, and that one doesn't have to believe in automatic writing to think this exists. And of course, by definition, you don't know what it is. You think you are controlling something, and then you will betray something else that will perhaps be what the reader will like. And it's often been my experience, I would say, as an editor, that I don't know whether you've had that experience yourself, but at least we had that. We were two in our press, and we had a very simple modus operandi, which was that my friend, so I can name him François Dominique, and I is a law professor, now retired, also a poet and a writer, published many novels. We would say we have to be enthusiastic about a text to publish it, but we don't have to justify to each other why. It was very, very useful. We say, I like it. We didn't have to say why. And when we said, I don't like it, and often we were in disagreement. There was something I really liked and he didn't like, but we had said that rule. It was enough for him to say, no, sorry, I don't like it. I needed that a few times. It's very complicated to say why you like something or why you don't like. But it happened happily, quite often, not always. Once in a while, we both said, we love it. And then we would start the discussion with the author. However, what I recognized was that quite often, what we liked was not what the poet liked. See? And often the poet was a little shocked. What, you like that? Oh, it was a filler. No, that was good. Oh, really? It was not at all the intention, as it were. You see what I mean? The poet thought he or she was doing something, and we were struck by something else. And there were a few cases where the poet, I could say, almost created a sort of rejection of our reading, to the point that we thought, oh, maybe we're not going to publish it because they felt we were not exactly on the same wavelength as it were, and so on. So this is where, to return to our earlier discussion, this is where the conversation, and so I think it's important to have a conversation about poetry in those moments, not about the sublime or beauty or excellence or badness and so on, because at times a certain badness is interesting in poetry. This is what the poet that Eliot liked a lot, Laforgue, discovered. Laforgue experimented with the wrong meter. And Alexandrine in French is 12 syllables, and he would write Alexandrines of 11 or 13 syllables on purpose. He knew very well what he was doing. And so, bad, but more interesting than something that is just the always the same somehow. So bad at times is good. We see this other paradox in poetry, but it's only when you have a certain conversation, I would say, in very concrete terms, what do I like? Oh, you like that? And why? And so that we can then come to a certain agreement as to whether a poem has to be published. And here, I think poetry, really, we have somehow still today, we can distinguish between poetry and prose. There are, at least in the English-speaking world, in French, I'm not sure in the many Indian languages, whether this is so easy to distinguish, but we can say that a prose text can be more or less poetic. But if you write poetry, given the slightly different positioning in a certain tradition and a certain models, you will have something that is quite different. And then I can see that with poetry, you really have smaller audiences, but totally passionate audiences who will then love this or that and so on, and reject this or that. Like if we think of people like very important American poet who died recently, John Ashbery. We know that John Ashbery would compose his poems with little snippets from the New York Times and the things he would read, but what he creates is often quasi-meaningless, but beautiful and quite surprising. Okay, any other question facing this Celan? Okay, so I suggest to have, I think we don't have much time left. Maybe, do we need a pause for the last one or we don't?
I think we could go ahead because, or I don't know if you want to maybe carry a little bit of what you want tomorrow
Yes.
as we're kind of reaching
Uh,
past 15.
Maybe there was indeed a little more that I had in mind, but I think we can move on directly if you are not too tired. I know it's tiring to listen to the voiceover. So that's what I wanted to move on, and I'll do it very fast with Ponge. So this is I wanted to yes, Francis Ponge. I wanted to give you, so I need to share this. Because Ponge is a writer that Derrida has also worked on, and simply because in a sense, can you see the text?
Yes, we can.
Yes.
I've also
Okay.
shared
So I chose two texts of Francis Ponge because Ponge was more or less, you might say, he was a little older than Derrida, but a contemporary. He started publishing his texts in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and so on. Was very much around when Derrida was a young man. And what Ponge invented was a very particular way of writing simply. So I want to insist on this because, in a sense, in today's poetic world, Ponge, the title of the first collection, Le Parti Pris des Choses, meaning taking a stand with things, or deciding to be with things, was just presented as descriptions. And one that I like a lot because they are very short. It could describe a potato, a stone, animals at times, objects, the rain, and so on. And it's that one is about an oyster called the oyster. Just read, about as large as an average pebble. The oyster has a rougher texture, is color not as uniform and compromised by the silvery white sheen. It lives in a world of closed-minded isolationism, yet it can be opened. First, you will need a dull serrated knife, then hold the oyster firmly in the kitchen towel and try to pry it open from different angles. Impatient or delicate fingers get cuts and broken nails. The procedure is unrefined. As I work my way around edges, breaking them, I give my oyster a white halo. Inside, there's a whole world, edible and potable. The firmament, that's what we should call the upper shell, closed upon the bottom, framing a slimy verdant pond with a meaty sack in black lace that expands and retracts as I watch and sniff it. And very rarely, but it does happen, the meal comes with something extra, a pearl with which we can adorn ourselves. So it's a simple, it begins like a simple uh, descriptive poem, a pebble, rough texture. Then it's a sort of uh, uh, food section of the New York Times, how to open an oyster. I mention this because I am very fond of oysters. And in France, this is the month of oysters, December. And generally, around New Year's Eve, at least in my family tradition, we eat a lot of oysters. You have to know how to open it. This is generally my task. I know how to open oysters. You need indeed a special knife, and you need to use a towel. That's the best way. And it's a very simple way. And I think for me, I would say maybe this is just a French comparison. Opening an oyster is not very different from reading a poem or reading a text. I don't know whether you had that experience, but just in order to open an oyster, you just need to find with your knife, and at times it's not so easy to see the little hinge. An oyster is, you might say, an articulation of two halves, the upper shell and the lower shell. If you know how to find it, you don't need to push and you don't need to risk wounding yourself. Many of my American friends end up with bloody hands when they try to open oysters because they haven't understood where the hinge is. And of course, here you have this idea that an oyster is like a poem, the whole world. You can eat it, and or you may be disgusted by it, because as you know, and the French often add some lemon to the oyster. Why? Not just because the taste is better, but if you put lemon, you will see whether the meaty sac expands and retracts. If it does not, don't eat it. It means the oyster is dead and you could be sick. Okay. So the oyster is a good example of, at least for the French, absolutely socially sanctioned eating of a living body, the living body of an animal that we eat, knowing very well that it has to be alive. At the same time, here in that poem, I hope I'm not disgusting you too much, but it's quite a delicacy. It's true. Of course, very rarely will you find the pearl inside the shell. And this is this poem. I would try to return to it from the angle of Derrida, the animal that therefore I am. We talked very, very briefly about Bobby, Levinas, and the dog. It's not a poem Derrida mentions actually in that last book, but it's a good, let's say, animal to observe, because one question we may ask is an oyster a subject? Is an oyster an individual? Is an oyster a person? Does an oyster have a face? Does an oyster have an eye? And so on. Can an oyster look at you? If an oyster looks at you, will you eat it or not? Or do you need to believe that the oyster looks at you to eat it? Or do you need to believe that the oyster will not look at you to eat it? Will you not eat the oyster if you think the oyster looks at you, and so on? These are some questions that are not only gastronomical, but I would say foundational, and that I think we can pose to the question of the animal with Derrida and with Ponge. The second poem, Snails, is much longer, and it also begins an animal poem. Each time, as you can see, there is a sort of moralization of the description. In the oyster, you have this paradox, this idea of close-minded isolationism. But as we know, politically, isolationism can then lead to invasion. Think of China and the British in the 19th century, and a whole world inside, a firmament that is the sky and the earth, and perhaps the extra gift of the pearl. The snail, and here maybe I chose unconsciously two delicacies for the French. We also eat snails. And this time you can see, unlike the ashes that make the home with hot cakes, snails prefer moist earth. Go on. They advance while gluing themselves to it with their entire body. They carry it, they eat it, they shit it. They go through it, they go through them. The best kind of interpretation, that between tone one, passive one, active. The passive bathes and nourishes the active. And so, more to be said about Lane. Immaculate clamminess, their sang-froid, their chattiness. You can see it's a discourse about snails that, in a sort of parody of anthropomorphism, makes the snails almost human. See, the snail, many of the trenches quality, and it ends with this: the snail speaks, the prosopopoeia of the snail. At the same time, I glued to the earth, always touching, always progressing too slowly, always capable of pulling loose from the soil into myself. Après moi le déluge. I don't know whether you know this sentence that we think Louis XIV said, after me, the flood. I don't care. The slightest kick may roll me anywhere. I can always get up against one single foot and reglue myself, and so on. Joy to the snail. This sort of paean to the snail. Alone, yes, the snail is quite alone. He has few friends, and so on. He's nothing like the pig. Nothing could be more beautiful than discreet advance. Is the anger of snail perceptible? See, all those questions asked, the egotism of the snail, and they are heroes at the end. The lowly snail is a sort of hero, and at the end, how are they saints at the end of this book? The snails become saints precisely by obedience to their nature. So know yourself and accept yourself for what you are, in agreement with your vices, in proportion with your measure. What is most appropriate to the human being? Words, decency, our humanism. So just to give you an example of the really subtle art of Ponge, and here maybe I'll just leave you to read. I think Arca, can you can share with them the Ponge handout, okay? And I think the best is that you take a look at it and see how Derrida, you can just read some of it, but fundamentally, in a very playful manner, Derrida plays with the name Ponge. So Ponge is a French name, but he writes in French, signé, like signed, Ponge. Signed Ponge, or signed by Ponge. But in a funny manner, just putting the two words together, signé Ponge, it transforms Ponge into éponge. See? And so you have signe, éponge, sign, éponge. So éponge in French means a sponge. And so Ponge, the poet, becomes an animal, éponge, and an object we find in the kitchen, and a sort of absorbing tool that absorbs signs. The very subtle game, but you might say like a joke, almost at the expense of Ponge. a play with Ponge's name and so on. And so we'll, since I'll mention a few things again in connection with Ponge, but in a way, Ponge is a crucial moment in Derrida's confrontation with poetry. See, because here we find somebody who doesn't transform the language. Remember that, but we'll see with Joyce, with Finnegan's Wake, there is a transformation of language. Ponge works with the most basic signifiers. It's not indifferent to know that Ponge for a while was a member of the Communist Party, and he was trying to write poetry that everybody could read. I want to insist on this because it is something that has often been decried. People talk about the elitism of poetry, the fact that indeed, if we read poetry generally, we need to have read things about the gods, about Dante, about the main names, and so on. It's like difficult contemporary music. And if you're not cultivated, you may not understand anything or write terrible, naive things. Sure, but with Ponge, who was not a naive writer, there is a certain work that goes through the everyday sayings, sort of banal moralizations we use about animals, the world, and so on, and then pushing them simply by continuing to write and to describe. So it shows a sort of new objectivity, you might say, which is the poetic counterpart of the Nouveau Roman of Robe Grillet, but with totally different effects than Robe Grillet and the Nouveau Roman. So we'll return to this. If there is one last question, I'll take one last question, and then, but maybe there is no last question.
May I very quickly sort of ask you to perhaps say a little bit more about this lingering notion of the non-human that seems to persist here, right? From the hedgehog to the snail to the oyster, and how the non-human is almost the way Derrida seems to imagine the inhabitation of poetry, the body of the poem, in a sense that, perhaps protects itself from interpretation, especially in that hedgehog example,
Yes.
rounds itself up in a ball. And
Yes.
I was thinking whether you could very briefly, because it might be helpful for the students to sort of, whether you could very briefly mention at least the idea of signature and counter signature here in Derrida.
The idea of the
Signature and the counter signature.
Yes.
That mention of the play
That's so. But the signature is a question I'll return to next time, because this is a key somehow to Derrida's concept of the performative, and so I'll have a little take that I'll give next time. But yeah, the idea of the non-human, the idea of the animal first of all, and then the non-human. Because what is interesting in Ponge, although I didn't give you any example, is that he can describe, let's say, a pebble, a stone. So what does it mean that literature can make a stone speak? That's the key somehow. I think it's easier with the animal because in the animal, we saw this rapidly. Derrida criticizes Heidegger mostly for his inability to read, say, Rilke's animal poems somehow. Because for Derrida, the animal is not in language. And so that's a key difference. And if he's not in language, if they are not in language, animals cannot be in a house of being. And so this little detail, see, it seems very, you can say that Heidegger did not write much about animals, just a few pages in passing and so on. But that for Derrida reveals a very strong limitation of Heidegger's conception of language, that language should be human language. If, and so here, this is a little the point of view of an author I like a lot, like John Coetzee. Coetzee if there is something like literature, you can write what an animal feels like. There's no need to say, oh, this is not language, this is outside language. There is nothing outside language in a different sense. So that's a key. So the non-human is already in language. Heidegger says it anyway, and it's contradictory here, but he says, when I walk to the woods, and the woods are in language and so on. But talking about real animals, said, no, they are not in the world, they don't have the world, and so on. So it is the conception of the world that is at stake here. And of course, the idea of the signature is the fact that Ponge himself was aware of the funny fact that his name could be, and of course, I guess all of us, when we are children, we hear, I don't know about Indian names, but at least French names, you can easily make puns, make jokes, and so on. My name, there were many jokes when I was at school and so on my name that are untranslatable and so on, but we would all make fun of each other's name. So you learn somehow that your name may be read by others as meaning something else and so on. But this is the question of the signature, which is a key concept for Derrida. And we could say, indeed, also for Lacan, that a writer will not only give you a text, but will sign it. And for Derrida, by just taking the pure coincidence that a name may mean something or may not mean something, or that a name would be an invented name, like Paul Celan was not his real name. His real name was Anchel, and he decided to take Anchel Chelan. And so, which was an interesting decision about playing around and inverting the name that had been given at birth. As we know in many traditions, especially in Japanese literature, no name is the birth name. They all choose, they have to choose. If you become a writer, you choose a name. And this is an old tradition. Standard is not Standard, is Henri Bell, and so on. Many authors, Lautréamont, in French literature, in Italian literature, and so on. Many authors change their names, and so, but mostly, I would say, in the Asian domain. So the signature is also at times an artificial signature. But we'll return to this next time. So I suggest we do this next time. We'll begin with a rapid recap on Ponge and on the Ponge reading Science Ponge, because it's a very good translation, the Science Ponge, that is quite accurate. And then we'll go on with Joyce. So with that, there is a lot to do. But thank you very much for your excellent questions. And I hope you have a good evening. Bye. See you soon. Bye.
Just give me